Good morning, good afternoon. Thanks guys for your patience in a few technical difficulties this morning, but I think that we're on the right path right now. I wanted to welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is our third PERG coffee break. My name is Anna Mayo. I'm with MPD Cameras and Lighting out of Dallas. I'd like to introduce a couple of people who are going to help today. We have Jaclyn Ruocco, who is an associate of Ellenoff, Grossman Schole LLP, specializing in employee and labor laws. She has Scott Taylor as well, who is going to be on this call talking to us about the legalities related to the COVID vaccine. I know a lot of people have questions. It's certainly a hot spot. Questions were introduced ahead of time, so we'll address those, and we will also have time in the chat, which I'll get to in a second. Before we really get started, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all of our wonderful sponsors. We currently have 4 annual sponsors. I'd like to thank Panavision, Taylor & Taylor, Canon, and Aerie. We also have some specific sponsors for our PERG coffee breaks, and those sponsors include Core SWX, Fujinon, Kerner Camera, Light Gear, NFP, Rat Pack, and the Camera Division. So for a couple of housekeeping items, similar to previous coffee breaks, if you can everyone can make sure that the top right corner, you have it on speaker view, and you will be muted until we get to that Q&A time. I think it's going to continue to be muted, but feel free to log questions throughout the time period on the chat. We'll do about 20 to 25 minutes of the dialogue with Jackie, and she's got a PowerPoint to show us as well. And then we'll have it open for some additional Q&A. So without further ado, Jackie and Scott, thank you.
So I'll start and then I'll just hand it over to Jackie. The conversation from an employer perspective keeps changing and evolving. Back in the spring of last year into the summer, most of the dialogue and topics of conversation were immunity for the employer, both from a federal and a state perspective. Then pretty much as the summer started and production started to ramp up, the conversation became, how to create protocols and what PPE was going to be necessary to safely protect employees in rental houses as well as crew working on set. The conversation now is going to evolve to, with the vaccine, how does that change what employers should be doing, those things they should be thinking about, and as respects that, I'll turn it over to Jackie. I did poll 10 rental houses to ask them 3 questions, and I'll give you the answers after the fact. But basically, I asked if the vaccine were you could legally mandate that your employees take the vaccine, would you be willing to do so? I asked, currently are rental houses testing the employees that they have working on their premises? And then the third question was, do you allow your customers to come into your premises? And if so, do you mandate that they get tested as well? But I'll share these, to keep a little suspense, I'll share the answers after Jackie's done with her presentation.
Thanks, Scott. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for having me. Thank you for inviting me. As Anna and Scott mentioned, I'm an attorney at actually, it's Ellenoff Grossman. I was at King Kessler last week, and we just transitioned. My entire labor and employment group just transitioned to a new firm. So I have to get that programmed. So happy to be here. I put together just a very brief PowerPoint to talk about COVID vaccinations in the workplace. That is the topic of the day, obviously. And so I want to take you through that. And then of course, I'm here to answer any questions that you may have. I'm going to do a quick disclaimer right now. I have a 9-month-old puppy in the apartment that is usually in daycare, but New York City and the surrounding area got hit with a snowstorm, so the daycare is closed, and he likes to make appearances on Zoom calls. So I apologize in advance. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. Just give me 1 second. Okay. So just a little bit of background, as Scott mentioned, what we were talking about back in May, March, April, May with this pandemic is, can companies do health screenings on their employees? Can they take temperature checks? That was the big question at the time. And then once testing became more available, it was, can we diagnostic test our employees, or can we give them the antibody test? And the EEOC at the time published guidance on that issue. And they said, yes, you can do it because we're in a pandemic. Typically speaking, the general labor law that we're working under when we talk about things like health screenings and temperature checks and vaccinations is the Americans with Disabilities Act. Every state has their own comparable law, disability law. And generally speaking, companies have to, be careful with navigating those laws so that they don't either intentionally or unintentionally discriminate against employees who have disabilities. The ADA prohibits certain employer activities. One is mandating medical examinations of job candidates and employees. A medical examination includes temperature taking and diagnostic testing. The ADA also prohibits disability-related inquiries. That means companies can't ask employees questions that could either intentionally or unintentionally elicit information from the employee where they disclose some underlying disability. A daily health screening, when you're asking about COVID-19 symptoms, that's a disability-related inquiry. The exception to these prohibitions under the ADA and under most state law is if there is a direct threat in the workplace, meaning an employee poses a direct threat, then you can subject them to a medical examination, or you can ask them questions that may elicit responses regarding their disability. The EEOC, which is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which is the federal agency that enforces federal labor law, said, since we're in a pandemic, COVID-19 is a community transmitted disease. It's a direct threat in the workplace, regardless of who you are. So the EEOC said back in April or May, employers can conduct temperature screenings during this pandemic, and you can do diagnostic testing as well, COVID diagnostic testing. You can't test employees for the antibodies, because that doesn't necessarily help you remove the direct threat in the workplace, right? It's the diagnostic testing that you can do. So it's pretty specific with what you can and can't do. And we've been operating under that guidance since the beginning of the pandemic, and most states have either recommended or mandated the daily health screenings. And then the diagnostic testing hasn't been mandated by most states, but some have. And especially in the union context, there's been negotiations between employer bargaining representatives and the union on diagnostic testing. Now we're in a position where we're talking about whether or not to vaccinate employees. And you have two options. You can impose a voluntary vaccination program, which poses much less issues than if you mandate a vaccination program. Employers have in the United States always been able to mandate vaccinations in the workplace. I just don't think we've really seen it outside of the healthcare setting or the education setting. But the EEOC just recently published guidance saying, yes, you can do it. You can mandate vaccinations. You have to remember that with your union employees, before you mandate something like this, it's a mandatory subject to bargaining. So you would have to negotiate it with the union first with respect to your union employees. With your non-union employees, you can implement a mandatory vaccination policy. The EEOC gives a bunch of guidance on how to do it. I recommend that you do it through, if you're going to mandate, you would want to do it through a third party provider, meaning you're not going to contract with CityMD to conduct the vaccinations, because if you are in that contractual relationship with CityMD, then when CityMD has to ask questions of the particular individual who's getting the vaccination, then that equates to the employer asking disability related questions. And then we get into that area where it may be prohibited. So the virus is a direct threat, but the EEOC has said with the vaccination, as we get closer to herd immunity, then it may no longer be a direct threat in the workplace. And then if you're still mandating vaccinations and you're doing those disability related inquiries, it could potentially be violative of the ADA. So what we're saying is that if you're going to mandate it, you can mandate it, but have your employees go to a third party medical provider on their own. And what you're mandating is proof that they got the vaccination. Just a yes or no. No underlying medical information, because then you could potentially run afoul of not only the ADA, but Title VII, which prohibits discrimination based on certain protected characteristics, and what we call GINA, which is the Genetic Information Non-Disclosure Act. Basically, that law says you can't ask an employee about their family members' health issues. And those questions may have to be asked by a medical provider who's administering the vaccination. So it's better to keep it separate between the employer and the medical provider. You're just going to ask, did you get the vaccination? Yes or no. With respect to mandatory vaccinations, again, if it's voluntary, there's no issues. If an employee says no to a voluntary vaccination program, then that's the end of the story. You're not going to retaliate against them for saying no. If it's a mandatory program, then, by definition alone, there's going to be some repercussion of not getting the mandatory vaccination. Employees have generally 3 reasons that they could refuse to get the vaccination. The first 2 are really important to keep in mind, and they are really companies' obligations under the ADA, even outside of the vaccination context. So if someone has a disability that for some reason prohibits them from getting the vaccination, or if they have a religious objection to the vaccination, and that religious objection is construed under our federal law pretty broadly. It could also include just ethical and moral objections to vaccinations. If employees have one of those 2 reasons, then the company's obligated to engage them in what we call the interactive process. And all that means is that you sit down with your employee and you say, okay, you have a moral objection to the vaccination. Tell us, we'd like to know a little bit more information about that. What exactly are you asking? You're asking for an accommodation to our policy that you should get a vaccination. What kind of accommodation do you need? And that's the interactive process. That's the legal obligation a company is required to engage in. You don't necessarily have to grant an accommodation if it poses a hardship on the company, but you have to engage in the process first to get a little bit more facts, and each case is different. So there's a third reason, and this is not a labor law, but under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, there is a provision that says that an individual has a right to refuse a product, which here it's the vaccination, if the product hasn't gotten full approval by the FDA. And here our COVID-19 vaccinations are they only have EUA authorization, so emergency use authorization. I don't think, the last I saw, they were projected to get full approval by the FDA in 2024. So someone who doesn't have a disability or who doesn't have a certain religious, moral, or ethical belief could still invoke their right under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, if they even know about it. But both Moderna and Pfizer are obligated under this statute to give individuals notice of that right. So it's actually in the fact sheet for each of their vaccinations. So it's unclear whether or not the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act completely prohibits employers from requiring the vaccination. I don't think that it does unless we get additional guidance from the government. But what I think it does impose on an employer is that if someone says, I invoke my right under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, you're probably going to have to, you as the employer are going to have to engage in the interactive process similar to how you would have to if they invoke a disability right or a religious belief objection. The interactive process and the accommodation process. It's going to be interesting to see how this plays out, because the two main reasons or the two main accommodations that I think employers are going to say, someone says, I have a moral, ethical objection to the vaccination. I don't want to get it. So I'd rather work from home. Or they can say, look, we've been in the office for 3 months now. I've been wearing a mask. I'm socially distanced. You as the company put up plexiglass barriers. We've got our hallways marked on which direction you can walk. Those safety protocols are enough. I don't want to get the vaccination. I think it's going to be really hard for companies to say, first, if you've already had folks working from home during the pandemic, to now say that working from home poses an undue hardship, which the undue hardship could mean various things, but that's really the only reason why you can refuse an accommodation. So if you've already let certain job classifications work from home and they've done it successfully, I think that at least through the next couple of months of these vaccines being rolled out, if someone doesn't want to get the vaccine and they want to continue to work from home, I think that is probably a reasonable accommodation under the law. And then if you have folks who can't work from home, where they have to be in the office or they have to be driving or whatever it is that they do, customer facing, if they say, look, I've been wearing a mask this entire time, you've got all your safety measures, your protocols in place, I think it's going to be hard for a company to say, well, those safety protocols no longer work, because then you're just you're kind of saying that the protocols you haven't had in place since the beginning of the pandemic or since the time that you started operating again after everybody was shut down, that they're not enough. They are enough. So I think that's going to be a little bit of a dialogue back and forth that employers are going to have to engage in if they decide to do mandatory vaccinations. Even if someone refuses vaccinations, whether it's a voluntary policy that you have in place or a mandatory policy, there is an absolute prohibition on retaliation for someone who refuses. And retaliation can mean anything from discipline, sending home with no pay, unless you engage them in that interactive process and you decide that somehow a leave of absence is acceptable to the employee and to the employer, but it depends on the case. You can't fire someone for refusing the vaccination. Again, you have to go through that interactive process first. And if it really is a customer interfacing situation, I honestly can't think of a particular situation now. And if you can, happy to talk through it, where termination would be warranted for someone who's refusing the vaccination. Okay, so that was my very quick slide. I'm gonna just go back onto, okay. And that's a very general overview of the vaccination process in the workplace. I understand that some questions were posed to all of you prior to today, and that there's, I guess, a certain percentage of companies who aren't looking to mandate vaccinations. And it's interesting because back in the fall, when a lot of my clients who were closed were anxious to reopen, we got safety protocols in place, everybody reopened. And the next topic of conversation was, how do we get all our employees vaccinated and can we mandate it? And that was the general sense and feeling that clients wanted to do throughout the fall and through the holidays. And now I think it's a little bit different. I'm not so sure that anyone's signing on to mandating vaccinations just yet. So I'm happy to take questions and just start a conversation on anything you want to particularly address.
Let me just start with the results of that informal survey that I took, and then the few questions that I had already received. So to the answer to the question, if you could mandate the vaccine legally, how many companies would do so. Out of 8 companies, basically 3 said they would mandate it. The vast majority said they would not mandate it. In terms of the question, are you currently testing your employees? None of the companies are currently testing their employees. To the question, do you allow your clients onto your premises? The vast majority out of the 8, 6 of them said they do. 2 of them said they don't at all, and nobody's testing anybody that's coming onto the premises. So the one question that people really want to know the answer to is, can you incentivize your employees to take the vaccine?
Yeah. So this is a really interesting topic because generally speaking, under the Affordable Care Act, you can offer incentives for employees to um, participate in employer wellness programs. And the EEOC has recently taken the position that certain incentives above de minimis incentives, which is what they call it. And we don't really know what that means because the EEOC hasn't defined it. But anything above that could potentially be discriminatory, meaning if you've got a wellness program and you offer some type of monetary or other incentive for the folks who have disabilities who for some reason can't participate in the wellness program, then that policy, that incentive policy could potentially be discriminatory. The EEOC issued regulations and rules about de minimis incentives, and a court recently struck it down. So what that means is that the answer is not clear yet. We don't know yet. We expect the EEOC to revise its rules and guidelines, and it was actually expected to do so in 2020, and it didn't. So we'll see if we get anything. I expect that we will within the next couple of months. But I would say for now, generally speaking, if you've got I have talked to clients about who have decided not to mandate the vaccine, but they are going to implement an education program about the vaccine, talking about its safety, utilizing the Moderna and Pfizer fact sheets and information that they have about its safety. And they want to incentivize in that way, just by way of education, and then potentially offer some type of not stipend, but some type of monetary incentive to get the vaccination. I think for now, I think an education program is okay, talking about the safety of the vaccine if you feel comfortable doing that. And some companies are hiring outside vendors to do that. I think incentivizing a vaccination policy, I would hold off on putting that in place just yet. Because I think we're going to see a lot of back and forth between the EEOC and certain courts and advocacy groups about whether or not incentives are actually discriminatory. Not a great answer now, but it happens to be a hot topic legal issue now that we don't have a clear answer on.
So another question was, if you mandate the vaccination and somebody has a severe reaction to the vaccination, who's liable? Is it workers' compensation?
So I had to look this up. Generally speaking, if an employer mandates a vaccination and an employee gets a allergic reaction to it, it's covered by workers' comp. Now that could vary state by state. So I would check, if you're going to mandate it, I would check with your carrier. But generally speaking, it has covered in the past flu vaccination allergies. There's no reason to think it would be different for COVID vaccination responses / allergies.
Okay, another question is, what vaccination software is the leading software for people to find out who has and who has not been vaccinated? I don't even know if that's legal. Is that?
I don't even know if it exists. I tried to look into it yesterday, and yeah, it might not exist because it probably isn't legal. You can have the employer can have a yes, no in terms of who's been vaccinated and who hasn't, but that has to be kept confidential, and it certainly wouldn't be it certainly wouldn't be published to the general employee population or to anyone outside of the company.
I would think that as you get vaccinated, you could actually probably get a card, which proves that you've been vaccinated, and there could be a number, like if you're going to go to a live event, where you could actually input that number. But I think that would be something that would be specific to an individual, and it wouldn't be shared on a database, I'm
Right.
guessing.
Yeah. There's a lot of talk right now about vaccine passports, which is exactly what Scott just described, where you have a card with a personal identifying information on it, a number on it, and whether or not it can be used when you travel and things like that. But that's just discourse right now, not really anything that we see is going to be mandated by any governmental agency.
One of the things I was thinking in terms of maybe why companies might not want to do mandatory vaccination, it seems like there are more things that could go wrong in terms of what do you do if you have a key employee who doesn't want to get vaccinated? What happens if you don't do it correctly? What happens if a person has a bad reaction to it? Whereas if you do it on a voluntary basis, thus far, there does not appear to be much litigation in terms of people getting sick. The litigation that's occurred so far seems to be employment related, how you furloughed people, how you dealt with people who wanted to work from home. So if you don't make it mandatory and you keep it voluntary, and since there is wide community spread, it's going to be really, really, really hard for anybody to prove that they got, the virus in the workplace setting. But also, as the vaccine becomes available to everybody, those people that don't take it have assumed that risk. Would you agree with all that?
Yeah, I agree, Scott. So first and foremost, and this has been, as Scott mentioned at the outset, it's kind of been one of the bigger issues that companies have been concerned with shielding themselves from liability as they continue to operate or reopen during the pandemic, from employees who say, oh, I had to go to work and I got COVID there. It's always been an issue. This is a community spread disease. I always thought that there would be a causation issue with any employee trying to pin their virus infection on an employer. But then it's another level of protection. I agree that once the vaccination becomes readily available to everyone, if someone refuses the vaccination and then they actually get sick, and they try to pin it on the employer, I think it's going to be really, really difficult for them to do so.
One other slide that you shared with me yesterday, which will probably be of real interest to everybody on this call, everybody in our industry. New York State did contract tracing of all their test results, and from I think it was September through December, it was about 73% of the contract tracing said that it likely came from in your living room or social setting. What was really, of importance, and, basically our industry should take tremendous pride in it, the lowest transmission rate was in production.
Mm-hmm. I would love to show that now. I'm going to see if I can pull it. It's really interesting. It was about 20 or so industries or settings that through New York's contact tracing program, which is really the only program in the country, I think, that is as comprehensive in terms of contact tracing. And Cuomo didn't want, just background, I don't think he wanted to release this information, but certain trade organizations demanded to see the data results from their contact tracing, because like restaurant organizations, for example, because they were convinced that the infections aren't happening in the restaurant and indoor dining. And when you see it, it's pretty interesting, because there are about 20 or 30 settings, and 74, whatever percent it is happening from at-home gatherings, and then restaurants, hair salons, tattoo parlors, that's all at the end. And then right at the very bottom was media production. It's not published. I actually had to take a screenshot of that chart from a press conference that Cuomo did, and I tried to find if the Albany has published it anywhere, and I can't find it.
I went and found it, just by Googling it yesterday, and basically it's just a screenshot. It doesn't appear to be that it got published.
Yeah, I don't think they want to publish it. I think it's a little controversial because indoor dining is shut down. I think, and that doesn't necessarily jive with the data, but that's a whole other topic.
All right, so why don't we open up the question and answer to the chat room, and then I think, Andrew, if you could turn Anna on, she could ask all these questions.
I can go through these too if you want. It's however you guys want to do it. I see.
Yeah, I mean, if you can see them, that's great. We can start back early on. Let's see. Can an employer disclose to a client or customer which employees have been vaccinated or not?
So the employer can disclose to third parties that they have a policy in place of either voluntary or mandatory vaccination, and that everyone in the workplace is vaccinated, with maybe one or two who aren't, but they can't disclose they can't disclose the names of the employees. You can let them know statistics if it's really crucial for the client or customer to know, but you can't disclose the specific employee information.
Okay, if 75% of your workforce gets vaccinated, can there be different requirements for those who are not, such as still wearing masks, gloves, temperature check, etc.? Can you pick and choose?
So even with the EEOC guidance on vaccinations, it recognizes that herd immunity is going to take place at some point. And I don't, I've heard here and there that it's got to be about 70% of the population has to be vaccinated, and that would equal herd immunity. That may change. But generally speaking, like I said, you can certainly have individuals in the workplace who are not vaccinated because they chose not to for a protected reason, which are those three reasons that we discussed: disability, religious objection, and invoking their rights under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And in that situation, they should absolutely be following the regular safety protocols that you have in place, which is wearing a mask and social distancing. I mean, I don't know if that answers your question. You can treat employees differently. And I would think it would happen based on the employee's preference, and then whether or not they have a right, for example, to be in the workplace without a vaccination based on a protective reason. Does that help, Stacy? Or
she's muted, so she can't answer.
I think so. I don't know that she's able to answer. I think he's got everybody else muted.
okay.
So
Got it.
I think it's covered. If there's something else, she could do a follow-up and we could address that potentially later as well. The next question is regard to the contagious variants of the virus that are now out. And prevention, obviously, masks don't prevent 100% of deaths by COVID, but so far the vaccine is the comment. So the agreement that masks, et cetera, have worked up until now seems weak. Also, there are now more contagious variants. Doesn't that carry weight as well?
Well, are you asking whether the safety protocols that companies have put in place so far, and pursuant to CDC guidance, masks, social distancing, and OSHA putting up barriers and things like that, whether that doesn't work now because of the COVID variants? I haven't seen that. I think that those measures, those safety measures, apply regardless of the COVID variant, unless we hear something different. I think that's the question. But I guess maybe the question is, if we've got a more contagious variant, and you have someone who doesn't want to get vaccinated, are they a threat in the workplace because the masks aren't enough or the social distancing isn't enough? We haven't seen that yet. We haven't seen that those safety measures that the CDC is all over, and Johns Hopkins and Oxford University, everybody, is pretty much behind the 6 feet and the mask and all of that. We haven't seen that those measures don't protect against the new variant.
I think there'll be a lot of questions just in general with regard to the availability of the vaccine and the ability to mandate it. And then obviously these new variants, whether or not they actually will or will not be, will you have any coverage? Obviously it's an evolving situation, and it's going to be difficult to have answers on some of those. So I want to address a few others that are a little bit different, which are very viable. Many of us work internationally. If I tell an employee they can't go somewhere because they've not been vaccinated and it restricts their opportunity for advancement, can that be seen as discriminatory?
Well, if you have a policy in place that says you can't travel with us to another location because you haven't been vaccinated, I guess I would just be curious if they can still work in the location where you're based out of without a vaccination. That would be important. You can have a policy that's consistently applied across the board. And then of course the policy, by the way, if you have any kind of vaccination policy, it should be written. And part of that written policy is that you let employees know that they are entitled to accommodations. If you've got someone who doesn't want the vaccination, before you prohibit them from traveling or prohibit them from that work opportunity, the minimum obligation is to engage them in that interactive process that I talked about, which is simply sitting down with them and saying, hey, look, you can ask them questions at that point. Typically, you can't ask disability related questions, but at the point where someone says, I don't want the vaccination, you're kind of on notice where you can say, well, why? And if they start to give you a reason that starts to lead towards a existing disability or a religious, moral, or ethical belief, then you can continue to ask them questions so that you as the employer are entitled to get more information to, number one, determine whether or not they're actually invoking a protected reason, and number two, whether or not there's a way that you can accommodate them. You can get to a place after that process where you can say, look, we can't accommodate you. We just can't do it. But you have to go to you have to go through that process first.
Okay.
And like I said before,
I see you circling back to that process a lot. I think that's just a super important point, is to have those discussions. You've got to work through the accommodation discussion, because clearly you want to have, as an employer, everything in place to keep any thought of discrimination out of play.
right.
So without having those important conversations, I think that, that obviously is where you're having this go. I know we're getting shorter on time. I want to address just a couple more quick ones. One of them circles back on an item that we mentioned a minute ago with regard to incentivizing employees. Is it okay to offer paid time off to recuperate if an employee gets the vaccine as a way to incentivize? I would add to that. And then if that was the case, I would think, or other employees may view that as, it's preferential.
Well, okay. So look, I wouldn't even be surprised if we see some place like California-ish pass legislation that says you have to pay someone if you're mandating vaccines who has a reaction. It's like sick leave. I think if you have a policy where you're I was going to say mandating a vaccination, and you offer sick leave for anyone who has an adverse reaction to the vaccination. I think, again, if it's consistently applied, I don't think that's discriminatory. If you have someone coming to you and saying, I have a disability, I don't want to get the vaccination, but I want you to pay me the sick leave anyway, I don't think that would hold up for a discrimination claim. Yeah, I just saw the last comment. So it's a really great point, Mark, about the CDC, and most experts who are talking about it are recommending that even if you get the vaccination, you should still follow those safety protocols, which is another reason why I think it's going to be really hard for an employer to mandate a vaccination and then say it's not a reasonable accommodation for those who don't want to get it to come to work and continue to wear their masks and everything, because the CDC is saying you have to do it anyway. This is a really good question, Don. If you mandate a vaccination and you have some employees who refuse, and you go through the interactive process and you determine that their refusal is protected, and so you figure out an accommodation, including having them continue to work in the office wearing a mask and following safety protocols, can other employees who have gotten vaccinated say, I don't feel safe, I want to go home? Right now, and this could change, but I don't think so. Fear alone of getting COVID in the workplace is not a protected reason to walk off the job, unless you've got, with your union folks, some agreement in place. I do work with an industry right now where the union has negotiated into an agreement that union members can walk off the job for fear of COVID. But otherwise, unless you have an agreement in place, fear alone is not a reason to walk off the job. And in that case, it's all about communication and education. The safety protocols, as far as we know, even against the new variants, are enough to protect you. You have to follow them stringently. And the vaccination is just another added layer of protection. It's similar to the diagnostic testing. Diagnostic testing wasn't mandated really by any governmental agency, with some exceptions. But a lot of companies put in place a diagnostic testing program as an additional layer of protection, but that doesn't give employees the right to say, well, if you didn't get tested, I don't want to show up to work.
Well, I know our industry trade association just sent around a newsletter, talking about mandatory vaccination. So I know if people haven't started thinking about this in the next month, they're going to have no choice but to think about it. Also know that you do labor negotiations for multiple industries, one of them being the production industry. And I don't know if you could share. Do you know if the unions have started the dialogue about what to do with mandatory vaccinations? Are they in support of it? Everybody was fearful that the unions didn't really want to engage in testing initially, but then in reality, they went the other way where they wanted testing of everybody.
Mm-hmm. So there is one union. So I also work in the hospitality industry, and obviously, as you all know, the hospitality industry is one of the industries that just got decimated by this pandemic. And the union in that industry has taken the position that they want their workers to be deemed essential, in the sense where they're first on the list to get vaccinated, but they haven't taken the position yet with the employers, the hotels, to mandate it. And then in our industry, I have not seen Teamsters, IATSE, or anyone talk yet about mandating vaccinations among the union crew. And I really don't have a sense of whether or not they're going to do that. I think it's going to come down to the sense that the union gets from their members on whether or not they'd feel comfortable with a mandate.
Jackie, we've got one more, which is an interesting one, and I know we're going to try to wrap it up. If an employer provides an employee accommodations per ADA and the employee gets COVID, are they still required to be covered under workers' comp?
So Scott may know a little bit more about California law, but I think that expired. So the COVID, I don't think is generally covered under workers' comp. You would have to show that it was a work-related injury, and I'm not sure that you can do that with COVID. Generally speaking, under workers' comp, the common flu, isn't covered. So unless there was an outbreak in the company, and an outbreak is defined in our industry in California as 3 or more cases, I think. But it's not defined anywhere else in the country. And so I just think it's going to be really hard if you get COVID to pin it on the employer such that workers' comp would apply. I don't know if Scott has any additional thoughts on that, but
I think that's the safe answer that I would agree with.
Fair enough. Jackie, you had referred early on to a slide. I don't know that we saw that slide. I don't know if you can put it in the chat or share it. We can have it for later. So a couple people have asked about that.
The screenshot.
Was it just a screenshot? Okay.
Yes. You know what? Let me try to pull it now.
Okay.
And I'll put it, let me try to put it in the chat room. Give me 1 second.
Okay, perfect.
I can answer questions while.
Okay. Just kind of a follow-up to the last one, I guess, was in California, the understanding was it's presumptive still that it was from the workplace, or did that change regarding contracting COVID in the workplace and the workers' comp ramifications? Scott?
Yeah.
I'll just have to double check that. And I have Box's email, so I'll answer him back.
Okay.
Yeah, I thought that expired, but I would have to check to see if the governor extended that.
If you treat someone differently, those who are not vaccinated, by asking them to wear PPP and those who are, doesn't this then share the information with staff as to who is and who isn't?
I think the answer there is you should be asking everybody to still wear it. So I don't think you should ever get to that position.
Yeah, as long as the CDC is still saying that you have to follow safety protocols, even though you're vaccinated, I think everybody should be mandated in the workplace.
It's very similar to when you have to notify somebody if they're in close proximity who tested positive. People are going to be able to guess at some point in time, who did what, and who tested positive and who got vaccinated. I mean, you're not going to come out and tell them, but they're going to be able to guess.
Right.
Right.
So I know Jackie is working on finding that slide. If she's not able to get it quickly, we'll just try to put that in the recording version so that we have that for future reference. Because I know we need to start closing out and people are finishing their lunch and moving on. And I'm sure Jackie has other things on her agenda as well. So I wanted to once again thank Scott and thank Jackie for your time today. And thank you guys all for joining us. This has been our 3rd PERG coffee break, as I mentioned, and we are hoping to do more, but we would love to solicit some input from you guys onto some future topics that you'd like for us to address. Feel free to stick them in the chat now or to email Harry Box. It's harry.box@esta.org or any of us, and they can get it to the council so that we could come up with some more of these short breaks that I think are really quite helpful. So, Jackie, do you have anything else?
I don't. Thank you, everyone. It was nice to be here today.
Great.
Thank you, Jackie.
Thank you, Scott.